What's up, guys? Welcome back. We have a really good show for you today. So, there's a common misconception that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had some miraculous shift in ideology starting around the middle of the 1900s, especially around the time that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Allow me to go ahead and just debunk this for you. Now, pragerU did an awesome video and it really breaks it down well. But I actually have some data points that not only back up pragerU's video about how the party switch never even happened, but gives you even more insight onto why there was a huge shift in the voter demographic in the South out of the North. But before I go ahead and start giving you data, I want you to just think about how absurd this claim really is. Allegedly, Southern Democrats who were pissed off at Lyndon B. Johnson for passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 just decided to go and join the Republican Party, the same Republican Party that these very same Democrats had spent over 100 years violently terrorizing because of their civil rights agendas that took place in the South following the Civil War in the Reconstruction era. A lot of people think that the KKK was started to terrorize black people, and it was, but it was also primarily started to try and suppress the Republican vote and the growing Republican influence in the South. This is also the same Republican Party that Eisenhower belonged to, and Eisenhower supported the Civil Rights Act of 1957 that was passed, as well as the Supreme Court's decision of Brown versus Board of Education. It's also the same Republican Party that sent federal troops down to Central High School to enforce Brown versus Education decision and maintain order. And these are also the same Democrats who filibustered both the Civil Rights Act of 1957 just 7 years prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as well. To say that the party that started the KKK, the party that held slaves, the party that filibustered the Civil Rights Act, made a miraculous shift literally overnight to the Republican Party would be no different than saying that in 1944 Germany, you hypothetically had a pro-Jewish party along with the Nazi Party, and members of the Nazi Party decided to join the pro-Jewish party because they were pissed off that Hitler signed legislation to end the Holocaust and give Jewish people equal rights. That's literally what you're telling me when you say that these parties had a miraculous shift. There's really no better example to give. That's just how absurd this is. Oh, but Michael, the Southern strategy, Nixon's Southern strategy, right? Here's the thing. Nothing adds up. The timeline does not add up. As the pragerU video shows, one of the 21 Democratic senators that opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually switched to the Republican Party. The remaining 20 never switched to the Republican Party. They continued to run as Democrats and were voted out and replaced by other Democrats. The Republican Party didn't hold a majority of House and Senate seats in the South until 1994, 30 years later. Now, votes in the South, as far as the Black and Republican vote is concerned, was severely suppressed by Democrats who had a 100% monopoly between the 1880s and the 1970s on all state and local governments. The Democrats throughout Jim Crow had gone and not just purged the black voters from voter rolls, but also the Republican voters from voter rolls. There was hardly any Republican vote. 1965, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, you also had the Voting Rights Act that was passed. And what you saw is now you had, miraculously, a whole bunch of Republican votes in the South. The black voters, though, also started to vote in favor of the Democratic Party with Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, long before any transition was said to have occurred. But what really happened? Why was there such a huge change in voting tendencies from Democrat to Republican in southern states? While many of our current left-wing officials would like you to believe that below the Mason-Dixon line is still the old racist South, the opposite is actually true. As an economist, I tend to look for cause and effect scenarios outside of the typical narrative that's given to me by a politician who is just trying to gain votes and push a narrative. Here's the thing. When you go back to the 1890s, the same time that Democrats passed Jim Crow laws, the U.S. Supreme Court deemed a policy that was being pushed by the Democrats as unconstitutional. That policy was an income tax, which did not exist in the U.S. at the time. Not only an income tax, but a progressive income tax. And what you can see is that the Democrats have always had a race or class-based platform. They had it during the Civil War. They have it today. Everything they do has been race and class-based. They have also supported welfare policies, the New Deal with Roosevelt, progressive taxes in the 1890s and staunch progressive taxation now on the rich. There's no difference. The Democrat platform has not changed. Now, I started reading about the 1910 migration of Southern blacks out of the South. This was referred to as the Second Great Migration, and led me to remember the history of my own hometown. I'm from Southwest Florida. There was a massive population influx around the 1940s and 1950s. We had a military base, and a lot of these soldiers following World War II ended up moving back to my hometown. That increased the population significantly. I found a study by Harvard University. The link will be in the description for the video. What it shows is from 1950 to 2000, the South population outpaced the North. The share of the US population located in the South went from 24% to 30% between 1950 and 2000. The average income in southern states grew from 74% of the national average to 91%. Data also shows that the average home price in 1960 was substantially lower in the southern states than it was in the northern states. And this trend actually held pretty true until the 1980s. Florida really caught up, and into the 90s and 2000s. There was also a significant trend that started to occur around 1960 as far as population growth goes in southern states. Coincidentally, this change occurs right after Eisenhower signed his famous infrastructure bill that built the interstate system. And now you had a way for the common middle class northerner to travel south and do so in a much faster way than they would by train or by boat. This led to an opening in economic activity and economic opportunity, and it actually shifted the South's economy from being predominantly agricultural to more of an industrial and tourism and real estate based one. It also opened up a huge trucking industry around the whole country. Home prices remained so low because massive residential housing projects that were supply driven with the anticipation of population growth instead of immediate demand. Basic principle of economics: if prices are driven by excessive supply, those prices are going to remain low. And if prices are driven by excessive demand, then the prices are going to remain high. So you have a whole bunch of construction going on. You have new roads opening. You have more access. You have more economic opportunity. And ultimately, what happens is you have people moving from the north to the south. And a lot of these people moving from the north were Republican voters. Looking at population trends of northern versus southern states between 1950 and 2000, we can see a noticeable difference, especially between 1970 and 1985. For example, New York had 9 consecutive years of negative population growth starting in 1972 and ending in 1980. After that, it wasn't until 2000 that New York saw an annual population growth of over 1%. The voting follows the same pattern. Why would people want to move south? Well, a couple different reasons. The first one, though, is inflation. Between the same time of this 1970 to like 1985 shift, where we see negative population changes in northern states and very, very, very high annual growth rates in the South, you also had a time of extremely high inflation. Between 1968 and 1982, the United States experienced high inflation rates that were far above average. The increase in the cost of living in the North would have forced people to seek a cheaper environment with more opportunity. And you may ask, well, how come these voters tended to be Republican? Why weren't Democrats also moving? Well, every single state in the Northeast US is a forced union state, and unions have historically leaned Democrat. In fact, they strongly support Democrats, like illegally strongly support Democrats, but they tend to vote Democrat. A high inflation environment led to the demand for collective bargaining and the need for increased wages. We can observe this by looking at trends in union membership, and union membership started to fall from its all-time high in the late 1940s. However, we saw spikes in union membership in the 1970s. In public union membership actually hit all-time highs in the 1970s. Now, while collective bargaining can be a good thing, studies actually show that unions tend to increase unemployment rates because when you collective bargain and raise wages, you reduce the number of workers. You can't have both. So since companies have to pay higher wages, the trade-off is a more exclusive workforce. And several studies have shown that unions tend to be negative as far as their influence on wages of non-union workers in the same area. And now you have a large union population that very strongly supports the Democratic Party. They would have had more security as far as their livelihood than the non-union workers who tended to vote Republican. Those non-union workers now, because of the inflation in the North, would have moved south in order to find cheaper cost of living and more job opportunities that pay higher wages, because I just talked about how the wages in the South during this time had increased substantially. Realistically, what we see is that Republicans tend to follow economic opportunity as far as relocating more so than Democrats. The reality is that there was no shift in party ideology, but what there was is a shift in geographical location of the voters for the parties. Republicans simply moved south and flooded out the old Democrat voters. That's really all that happened. The Democrats are still racist. The only difference is just the change in where they're voting. This trend of them changing geographical locations, Republicans chasing economic opportunity, still holds true today. And we saw this during COVID, when California and New York experienced a mass exodus of its residents attempting to get away from highly unfavorable economic policies such as high tax rates or COVID lockdowns. And they tended to go towards southern states such as Texas, Tennessee, and Florida, who had much more attractive tax laws and business opportunities. You also see a trend in voting with Western states to around World War II, where the Western states tended to vote Republican. And that shows us that the people who had actually been a part of that Western movement tended to do so out of the Union states, and those tended to be Republicans. The same thing goes with Oklahoma, where people went and chased economic opportunity, and they tended to vote Republican. So throughout U.S. history, Republicans will tend to relocate chasing economic opportunity, and it's nothing more than a geographical shift out of the North and into these Southern Democratic states. There was no party change. There was no ideological change, nothing. But since Democrats started losing the South, they needed something to blame it on. And then they start coming up with the whole Southern strategy idea.